We have been starting a message series simply called Why, discussing, you might lose your base. I don't think it's screwed in. There you go. Just discussing, thank you very much, Matt. Discussing why, why do we believe? Why does it matter? Why? Why God? Why do we believe in God at all? And if we do, why do we believe the view about God? Why aren't we a polytheist, that we believe there's many gods? So how come we don't believe in pantheism, that God is essentially in everything and everything is in God? Why aren't we a deist or part of a cult? How do we know which one is right? And so we've been talking about that, and if this is your first time with us, you can go to New Life 906, and all the messages are there. I would encourage you to take a look at them, but we're continuing that thought. If you could help me out and just put the timer on the screen, I'd appreciate that. Why does it matter? 1 Peter 3:15 says, to always be ready with an answer for the hope that you have. And so especially in today's culture, are you ready at any moment to say, hey, this is why I follow Christ, or this is why I believe in God, or this is why, despite everything that happens in my life, why I keep going forward. And so to be ready, to always have a reason for the hope that you have. Number two, why does it matter? Because me, will be facing increasing times of difficult situations, especially in our culture, where we will be challenged. We're warned in Timothy that, hey, in the latter times, there will be a great falling away, and it will start from within the church. And so it's imperative as believers that we know what we believe and why we believe it, because within the church, there'll be deceptive things that will start falling away too. That's why it's important that we know why we believe. Number three, there's honestly an increasing view that says it doesn't matter what you believe, as long as you're sincere. As long as you sincerely believe it, it's okay. That's just crazy. If you think about that for a moment, to think that, so it doesn't matter what I believe, as long as I'm sincere about it, that makes it okay. That's just a crazy thought. Think about that for a moment. We've talked before about, if I think this is a God and I'm sincere about it, then that's okay. Of course not. It's a speaker, right? And so it's important to know why we believe. And the fact is, not everything can be true. Just because you say it's true doesn't make it so. So last week we talked about, how does Christianity, if you will, relate or add up, or how does it, as you compare it with Hinduism and Buddhism and other faiths, like how do you know which one's true? And so we talked about how Christianity, at its basic point, takes you back to historical, verifiable, reliable things that in time and space and history, Jesus Christ, who claimed to be God, walked among us, and we can go back to that. You look at Hinduism and other world religions, it's just a step of faith. I just believe it. I don't know why, just because I've experienced it. And so that's what we talked about last week. When the early Christians begin to share the good news, they discussed how Jesus came and died and rose again, how he healed the multitudes and forgave sins. But they never said, listen, just believe it. Just have faith. They never said that, bringing you to that relationship. They took you back to things that you could verify. For example, last week we talked about how in Acts chapter 1, verse 3, as Luke writes really a history of the early church, he explains about Jesus that after his suffering, he presented himself to them and gave how many convincing proofs? Many. He gave many convincing proofs, and we don't have them all, but we know that Jesus went out and showed himself alive in time and space and history, convincing that, hey, he indeed is God in the flesh who died for the sins of humanity. Acts 3:12, again, as a crippled beggar gets healed, people come running. Peter says, hey, why do you look at us? Why do you look at us? And then he points them to historical evidence of how they can come to faith. This Jesus, guess what? You handed him over to be killed. You disowned him before Pilate, a real person in history. You decided that he would die. You disowned the holy and righteous one. You killed the author of life. Not very friendly, is it? Not a very good way to bring people to church. You did it. You did it. And you see the similar thing happening, 1 John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 5, but repeatedly they point to historical evidence as the basis for your faith. It doesn't stop there. There's certainly experience. There's certainly God heals and changes lives, amen. We all testify of that, but that's not the only evidence that we have. So what do we do today? 2,000 years removed, what do? We can't go back to find the people that saw Jesus resurrected, correct? 2,000 years, they're dead. So we can't go back and say, hey, did you really, you touched his hand, Thomas? For real? Did your finger go through his palm? Do you ever wonder what that was like? Right? And so we can't do that. So what do? What do we do? How do we verify? I would suggest to you that you verify the historical evidence of Christ the same way you would of any person in history. If I asked you, how would you verify or how do you know that Abraham Lincoln lived? No one would just say, I just believe. You just have to have some faith. We would point back to historical evidence about writings or about people that spoke about him. We would point back to archaeology that agreed, would we not? It's the same concept with Jesus. Same thing with Julius Caesar. How do we know he lived? What does the historical documents say? Are they verifiable? Are they trustworthy? And so forth. So last week we just touched on that. We took a journey through Israel and saw the places that Jesus walked and ministered and the real places that you can look at and taste and touch. We said last week, I'd encourage you not to taste it, like the bricks, that's awkward, but you could. You could taste the brick. Today's message is continuing that idea. And what we're looking at is what we would call external evidence or evidence outside of the Bible to demonstrate that Jesus indeed was a real person in real history. So the people we're talking about today were as far removed from Jesus as you can imagine. In other words, they did not believe in this guy at all. So we're talking to atheists or other religious people but they wrote about him. What did they say? Let me just say this before I start on the message. This topic from today and tomorrow, next Sunday rather, is by far, I know I've said this before, but it's by far the most impactful truth that has kept my faith by far. I have gone back to this in the last 6 months repeatedly as I've struggled with the losing of my son and what that looks like and how do you wrestle with that. And I've had to repeatedly come back to, in time and space and history, Jesus Christ lived and died and rose again. I may not understand everything today, but I understand that Jesus is God and he's in control and I'll trust him no matter what. But you've got to come back to a basis for that. It was in 1991. I was in Mr. Woolwine's class, English 101. I had just gotten saved. I was an atheist, as many of you might know. I was raised in the church, but I was not a believer by any means, especially during high school. I had came to faith. I was taking a course at an extension course, kind of like you do with Global University. If you've been a part of that in our church, you've taken courses, something like that. At the same time, I was going to Morehead State at the same time. And this professor came in from Trinity, Mr. McRoberts, and he started talking about these people in history. And how they wrote this stuff. And I'm like, man, I've been in church my whole life. I've never heard of this. And immediately, man, must have been a couple days after I started taking English 101, Mr. Woolwine's class. We're getting in the classroom. And one of the first questions he asks is, how many of you are Christians? How many believe in Jesus? I've been, freshly saved. I'm like, both hands, absolutely. Right? Because when you're saved, you're on fire. There's nothing like seeing someone that just got saved. They go, and that was me. I'm ready. And And I think he was ready for that because he said basically, you're an idiot. And he said it to the class. He said, my goal in English 101 is to really make you lose your faith. I am telling you this topic. I know I'm setting it up, but I just need you to know how important it is this conversation I'm about to have, that in English 101, as a professor tries to get my faith away from me, this is what kept me solid in college. And so young person, you need to hear this. College student, you need to hear this as well. You have these in your notes as well. I'm just going to go through them real quick. But some of the historical evidence of Jesus Christ. The first one is a guy by the name of Thalius. Thalius was a Greek historian around 55 AD, and so we're looking just a few years after the death and the resurrection of Christ, who wrote three-volume account of Eastern Mediterranean area. Although his works have been lost, we do have fragments of it that exist through other writers that cite him over and over again. And this is very common in Turkey and in writing. So he is quoted in Julius Africanus, and here's what he says. Julius states concerning the darkness at the time of the crucifixion of Jesus, right? Real person, not make-believe. At the crucifixion of Jesus, quote, on the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake. And many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thalius, in his third book of history, appears to be without reason an eclipse of the sun. So here's Thalius, who is not a believer, not even Jewish, and he's saying, hey, I recognize that something happened. Something happened. I don't deny it. I mean, if you want to get rid of Christianity, just simply say, dude, what are you talking about? I was there. Nothing happened, right? Like by that time you had parts of the New Testament already circulated. So you could get rid of this whole Christianity thing by simply saying, no, there was no darkness, there was no earthquake. You're crazy. That's not what he said. What he did, and so many people did in that time period that were not followers of Christ, is they simply put a natural cause to a supernatural event. And so they simply said, no, there must have been a giant eclipse of the sun. Historically, you can look this up on your own time, there's no way there was an eclipse. That's very fascinating. And also in your notes, I have a little category, and it's called, what can we establish from this writing? And I'm not going to go over those. You can in your own time. But there's a lot of things in each one of these writings that you can establish about Christianity, about Jesus, and about faith very early in the beginning. Another one is Pliny the Younger. This is really the one that threw me for a loop. Pliny the Younger wrote several letters. He was a governor of Bithynia, an Asian Minor, a noted historian, wrote at least 10 volumes. In one of his letters, he writes to the Emperor Trajan, seeking counsel about what do I do, how do I treat these Christians, these Christ followers? What do I do with them? And there is probably 3 or 4 long letters of what early church was like. This was so overwhelming for me that I went to the Mort State Library, and I went to the library, and this is before they had Google or anything, right? I went to the library, and I simply didn't believe it. Like, this can't be true. And I said, is there an author by the name of Pliny the Younger? Yep. Do you have the books? Yes. Can I see them? Yes. And so she walks me over to this letter in the book, and she opens it up, and it was there. I photocopied it. I mean, but this was the most exciting thing I think I've ever seen. And so over and over again, it's crazy stuff. But here's what he writes. I'm going to have to summarize a lot. He said one thing, I've never participated in the trials of Christians. So again, he doesn't deny that there was Christ followers or that Christ exists. I've just never participated in their trials. And he's writing to Trajan, what do I do? Therefore, I do not know what offense it is the practice to punish. Which one do I investigate? And to what extent do I do it? And so he writes this letter. He goes on and continues. I interrogated those to whether they were Christians or Christ followers. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second time. Are you a Christ follower? Yes. And then You a Christ follower? A third time. I interrogated a second time and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I killed. Nice. Are you a Christian follower? Are you a Christ follower? Yep. I'm going to kill you. One more time. Are you a Christian? Are you a Jesus follower? Yep. This is it. One more time. Next time you're dead. Are you a Christian follower? Like you a follower of Christ? Yes. To quote one phrase off with his head. But that's like life. I want to go back to the New Testament times. No, you don't. How many of us will stand up today, right? Let me go on. Those, he goes on to say in another part of the letter, those who denied that they were or had been Christians when they invoked the gods and words dictated by me, offered prayer with incense and wine to your image, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose, together with the statue of the gods. And moreover, they cursed this Christ. So if I can get them to curse you, I can get them to worship other gods. And then he goes this, none of those who are really followers, it is said, can be forced to do. Is that interesting to anybody else? Because maybe today, why does this matter? Maybe today we're not tempted to give up God to worship the speaker. Maybe we're not. But aren't we kind of tempted some other ways in our culture? And it's not quite so blatant to us because we would see it if someone said, will you deny Jesus and I'll kill you? We would see it. But I think Satan is called the deceiver of thighs, and I think that what I think he does is he comes and he as an angel of light, essentially pulls us away by something that might look good, but is completely contrary to what Jesus already said. That's how he works today. Going on. He talks about torturing female slaves. He talks about deaconesses. He talks about excessive superstitions. He talks about the spread of the gospel. I have the place to look this up. I would just encourage you so much. Read this. Google it, get on your computer, not right now, but do it. It will change your whole perspective, honestly, on what Christianity looked like and should look like today. So what's the response? You observe proper procedure, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those who had been denounced to you as a Christian. Whoever denies that he is a Christian and really proves that he is by worshiping our gods, even though he was under suspicion in the past, shall obtain pardon. In other words, again, Trojan doesn't say, this is just foolish. He doesn't say, just show them that Jesus never lived or show them that he died. Right? He doesn't, no. He just says, hey, get him to recant. Let's stop this thing one way or another. Another writer is Suetonius. Suetonius was a lawyer, a secretary to Emperor Hadrian, a very prolific writer. In one of his books called The Lives of the Caesars, he addresses the expulsion of the Jews and Christians from Rome under the reign of Claudius in AD 49. And you can see that in Acts 18:2, just to verify again. Here's what he says. He, Claudius, expelled the Jews from Rome since they were always making disturbances because of the instigator Christos. Christos is a variant spelling of Christ. And so again, he doesn't deny that Christos or Christ lived. He doesn't say this crazy deal, I can't believe they believe that he lived, whatever. He says, no, hey, the Jews are going after this thing, and that's one of the reasons why Nero wanted to destroy Jerusalem. A second reference addresses Christians who were tortured by the Emperor Nero. Punishments were inflicted on the Christians, a sect professing a new and mischievous religious belief. What's that religious belief? That some guy claimed to be God and rose from the dead. That's pretty mischievous, isn't it? But again, he doesn't deny the existence of Jesus. He actually, hey, I recognize it, but it's pretty crazy belief is what he says. There's Cornelius Tacitus, another one that I got all the photocopies from his writing. There's a lot that he writes. AD 56, 120 AD. He's considered to be the greatest Roman historian with 30 books written a senator under the reign of Emperor Vespasian, 69 AD to 79 AD. From 112 to 113 was proconsul of Asia. And he explains how Nero handled the rumor that he himself set fire to Rome in AD 64. Here's what it says. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite torture on a class hated for their abominations, called what? Christians. By the populace. Christos, another name for Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, real person, real history, at the hands of one of the procurators, Pontius Pilate, real person, real history. He even goes to explain one of the ways that they were killed. Mockery of every sort was added to their death. Covered with skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished. They were nailed to crosses or were doomed by the flames and burnt. Ouch. They served as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. You're talking major persecution as early as 64 AD. Major persecution. But people believed in this Jesus, this Messiah that died, that rose again. This is stuff we can hold on to. Why do you keep believing? Man, there's too much evidence for the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Again, I would encourage you to look. There's a lot of things more that he says. Another person is Maribar Serapion, was a prisoner. He writes a letter to his son, and in that letter he says this: what advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? So there he recognizes that indeed Jesus claimed to be the king of the Jews, and they executed him. It's a verifiable event in history. It was after that that their kingdom was abolished. So again, we see what Nero did in 64 AD. He goes on to say this: nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had been given. So he recognizes that Jesus killed, still lives on in his teaching. Still a great movement following him. Lucian of Samosata writes, the Christians, worship a man to this day. The distinguished personage who introduced the novel rites was crucified on their account. Lucian is a Greek satirist, a traveling speaker, and in kind of almost this mockery and this sarcasm, he kind of makes fun of the Christians. 115 AD to 200 AD is when he lived. He goes on to say that it was impressed on them by the original lawgiver that they're all brothers from the moment that they are converted, that they deny the gods of Greece and worship this crucified sage and live after his laws. So here we have a satirist, again, recognizing in history that this Jesus indeed lived and people are following him and they're getting converted. There's a phrase we use this today, that they're all brothers and sisters in the Lord when they're converted. This is great stuff, and commanded to keep obeying his laws. You could go on with Celis. He wrote several books. It was really attacking Christianity, called The Doctrine. I think he writes things such as Celis accused Jesus of having invented his birth, of being born a virgin. He accuses him of, and actually mocks. He says, was the mother of Jesus beautiful? Did God have sexual intercourse with her because she was beautiful? I mean, he's mocking, right? You see it? Like, here's a satirist, not a believer, mocking Christianity because of the very things that we talk about. And so again, we're not here to disprove this. We're here to say this is real history. This stuff was being shared thousands of years ago. Although by his nature he could not have a mortal body and so forth. You can read it there in your notes. Other statements he says is things like this. Jesus' physical appearance was ugly and small. So in other words, in his mindset, this would be the least that God would choose, right? An ugly and small guy, no way. It doesn't even make sense. It talks the fact that he only gathered 10, not 12. So he doesn't deny the fact that he had followers, but he only had 10. He didn't have 12. He goes on, remember the reports of the resurrection. So this is how he explains them away. The reports of Jesus' resurrection came from hysterical female. right? I think it was Mary that leaves the tomb hysterically. And belief in the resurrection was a result of Jesus' sorcery. Jesus was like a sorcerer, so he put a spell on everybody to let them believe that I'm alive, but he really wasn't. Do you know what I mean? It's crazy stuff. But you see in history them trying to figure out, I don't want to convert to Christianity, so what can I do to disprove it? I love this. I love this. There's so much more that we could go over, and the next week we're going to touch a few more things. But again, we need to know why we believe what we believe. Amen? You need to know why you believe. If you're in high school, you're in college, you're heading that way, you have got to be able to defend your faith. You've got to know why you believe. You will be attacked over and over again. Next week, what about those who followed Christ, and what did they say? How do we know the Bible's reliable? That's where we're going to go. And then the following week, we're going to start looking in the book of Daniel. I'm excited to do that, and we're going to stay in Daniel for a while and just talk about some things. So that's kind of what's happening.